So what that tells me is if I can regulate my body just through sensory tools and things I'll talk about, the breath, eyes, and touch, then that's, influencing 80% of the information that's going up into my brain. So not only am I calming down my body so I can perform better, so I can feel better, but at the same time, it's calming down my brain. It's going to calm down my mind.
That was David Durand, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. This week's guest is David Durand. David is a coach, and he's the author of Bet on It, a psychological approach to coaching Gen Z and beyond. David is a strength and conditioning coach, a basketball skills coach, and he's trained in psychology, and he uses this skill set to help athletes, particularly those in Generation Z, have a better, more balanced, and more embodied training experience. On today's show, David will be talking about the impact of modern life, technology, and social media on the nervous system of the young athlete, as well as athletes in general, and how concepts from Polyvagal Theory can be applied to enhance the training session. He'll be talking about the B.E.T method, or breath, eyes, and touch, how we can incorporate these into the training session, this and much more on the show. This is such a valuable area to study and to incorporate in training. Let's get on to episode 425 here with David Durand. David, welcome to the show. It is fantastic to have you here. I'd love to hear a little bit, just as a starting question, on what got you interested in the sports psychology piece, so that mental, emotional piece alongside the physical part of the athletic equation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, first of all. And yeah, for me, I feel like the biggest thing was my own athletic journey. I was a big basketball and soccer guy. And so I feel like the mental always played a big part for me. When I say mental, I mean social and emotional as well. I feel like I was loving training. My focus was on the physical and trying to get more athletic and get my skills better. But I think what held me back ultimately was that mental emotional piece, kind of being able to not hold myself back, free myself up to make mistakes and just go for it sometimes. So when I'm kind of reflecting on my own athletic journey, I feel like it played a pivotal piece. And then after high school, getting into college, and after college, coming back to now I'm the trainer, now I'm starting to coach and be on the other side of these things and working with athletes and, the modern age athletes, Gen Z and beyond athletes, start to see how there's a lot of fear of failure and making mistakes. And I started to see that, my work with the strength and conditioning, my work on the skill side of things was good and helpful, but really where things can make a difference was on the mental side. So even just working with athletes now, I've seen the past several years how engaging with their minds when they're on the court, when they're training, post game, pre game, being able to help them a little bit, free themselves up, giving themselves permission to make mistakes and be creative and realize that it's just a game, that we're out here to have fun and develop and just kind of free up to do that. So, I started more on the strength and conditioning and skill side of things, and then got my master's in psychology and started kind of combining it. So now, I work in this space where I have my own business and I kind of combine the mental and physical with the skill, depending on, the person who I'm working with, depending on their needs. So yeah, kind of do a little bit of everything because it's all interconnected. But at the same time, my focus right now is definitely heavily on the mental piece.
Yeah. And I know that's been for me when I was in my 20s. And that's why I'm so impressed by like you're still a Gen Z coach, right? Like you're a Gen Z generation.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so impressed by that like social, emotional, and play awareness I see in so many Gen Z coaches. And I think that, I think it's the tip of the spear in that regards. And when I was in my 20s, I just could care less. Anything mental and emotional was just not even on my radar. I remember one time my boss, because I was a track coach, but I also was assistant cross country for my first job, which assistant cross country basically meant I held a stopwatch and I got mile splits and stuff like that periodically. Right. And I just remember one of the meets, I don't know why I remember this so well, but one of our top runners did really, really bad at the conference meet. And my boss, who was the head coach, was like, oh, he just quit. He just quit halfway through. I saw it. And in my mind, it was all physical. It's like, oh, no, well, the training obviously was messed up somehow. He peaked too early or whatever, And so I only saw things on that layer. And these days, I wish I could go back in time and see what my former boss was seeing with that, and understanding. And that's the fun of it too, is understanding those. I like how you said social emotional, because it is, I don't know, like everyone loves mental training, but it's rarely unpacked, and given its due credit. And social and emotional are words that really, I think, can help to confirm just the layers and importance behind all those, facets of it. So with the first aspect of this, I think the spearhead would be, how is Gen Z different? And maybe you could, what are the ages too? I need to be reminded sometimes. Ages of Gen Z. How are they different mentally and emotionally than prior generations? And also just with that, I think sometimes, and I mentioned this before we started, but everyone's like, oh, my generation was the best and this generation's soft. And we always think the best of our own generations or whatnot. And sometimes, but how do we know it's different? I guess maybe not only is it, but how is there, trend lines that show, yes, this is definitively how there's different things in the environment that impacts this generation that we need to be aware of?
All right. Yeah, I think there's, that tendency for any generation or any person to kind of look into the past or look on their own group of people in kind of a romantic way and over romanticize it a little bit, not always acknowledge the realities and the things underneath the surface. But when we're looking at Gen Z, we're looking at, people born 1996 and after. And there's other subcategories of generations there, like Alpha and, as you go kind of down the chain there. But, Gen Z 1996, around 27 years of age and younger. So when we look at that, we see in particular, Jonathan Haidt's, a famous social psychologist, just came out with this book, The Anxious Generation. Fantastic book if anyone else wants to check it out and dive into this stuff. But there's a window between 2010 and 2015, especially where social media really came online and started taking off, Facebook and Instagram and beyond. But in that window, you just see these spikes in mental health. Anxiety beginning to increase, in 10, 15 years, spiking 150%. Same thing with depression. So, not just people feeling sad or feeling anxious, but clinical disorders and people being diagnosed in these generations. And it's impacting that generation more than any other, I think, partly because of social media. But it's also just a different world. It's a different world right now than it was 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. So if we just look at those trends, okay, that's a reality that's happening. The population of athletes, youth athletes, is reflecting that general population. And so you're kind of, seeing, if you're coaching today, it's a little bit different than maybe it was 15, 20 years ago. If you've been coaching that long, you can kind of compare. And I think the underlying human condition is still the same. We fear failure. We don't want to make mistakes. We're overly concerned with our self-image. All of these things that are just human, and evolutionarily, we're just wired that way. However, I would say that the current culture, and in particular social media, the pressure to perform, to always look flawless, everyone's fascination with TikTok highlights and everything. If you watch a video, you see the superlative. It's the highest, the biggest, the best, the hottest, the this, the that. And so we're always looking to be in that top category. And so with these current trends, they exacerbate these underlying insecurities that we have, these underlying things, maybe flaws in our human nature, where we are afraid to fail, where we're afraid to look bad, we're afraid to just go for it sometimes because we don't want to embarrass ourselves, that we care so much about what other people think about us that we don't end up doing the things we want to do. All these human things, I think, end up getting exacerbated by the current, I would say, cultural climate that is driven a lot by performance and image and appearances, especially with social media and media in general.
Yeah, I know you mentioned Jonathan Haidt. I know I'm a big fan. My wife reads his work as well. And there's that trend line. It's like 2010, all of a sudden mental health, the prevalence of mental health issues from 2010 just starts spiking up. What happened in 2010? Smartphones and all that. And it is so interesting. And I know the athletes I see, you're working in high school now, the athletes who have their phones before or after practice. So let's dig a little bit deeper. In the book, you talk a lot about polyvagal theory and stress and how we perceive stress. So tell me a little bit about that first. And then what does that mean specifically for working with a Gen Z individual?
Yeah, absolutely. So polyvagal theory is a theory. It's a counseling psychology theory that roots itself in the nervous system. So when I say nervous system, I just mean the brain and the body and how they communicate with one another. And so polyvagal theory dives into how the nervous system evolved, millions and hundreds of million years ago. we had, I break it into action mode, shutdown mode, and connection mode. So shutdown mode is when you just freeze. You think fight, flight, or freeze. This is the freeze response. This is where we freeze and we're just still and we shut down. You think of performance when people refer to like choking under pressure, and in performance where you just freeze and you can't perform how you want to perform. That is the shutdown mode. So that's when your nervous system is just totally overwhelmed and overloaded. It's so stressed out that you're just frozen. And then you have the action mode. So action mode is fight or flight. Action mode is when you get so stressed, you kind of have that anxious energy. You're a little bit, jittery. You're tight. You're maybe impulsive or reckless at times. And so those are survival modes. It's just natural part of being human that you're going to experience that, maybe every day, maybe in performance, maybe in work, whatever facet of your life, you will experience that. However, humans evolved with other mammals this connection mode. And connection mode is where we're most in touch with ourselves and we're most in touch with the environment, where we are not living from a place of insecurity, but we're living from a place of belonging and relational stability. And so in connection mode, you have access to the gas and the brake pedal. So if you think of your brain and body, they have a gas and a brake pedal, autonomic nervous system, sympathetic would be the gas, parasympathetic would be the brake. And so in performance, and athletes need to have access to both, because there's times where you need to hit the gas and you need more energy and you need to go do that high jump. And then there's times where you need to hit the brake and you need to calm down. You need to listen to your feedback from the coach. And I would say the best athletes, the great athletes and the great people are flexible. They have access to both the gas and brake pedal because they try as much as they can to live in that connection mode where they're connected with themselves, they're connected with their surroundings, they're connected with other people, and they live from that place of internal security. And even if they get thrust into action or shut down, they find their way back to connection. And so I think, this is really pertinent to Gen Z athletes today because typically their nervous systems are dysregulated. And I'm going to connect that, to the performance culture, to the social media, to constant scrolling and comparing yourself and always seeing people's highlights and perfections and, unrealistic standards. And they typically send themselves into action mode where they're anxious and trying to prove themselves. And if you, stay in action mode for too long, you'll end up in shutdown where you're exhausted, kind of burnout, unmotivated, unwilling to do things or receive feedback, disconnected. And I think as coaches, we see this a lot with athletes today. And that's what I'm saying. These are underlying human things that have been here for hundreds of millions of years in all animals, and ever since humans were a thing, they've been in us. However, they're exacerbated today, and we see nervous systems, the brain and the body are a lot more dysregulated with these modern generations. And so I think there's a huge need to try and help them control their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and regulate their brain and body.
Yeah. So with that, essentially, action is basically the gas, then shutdown's the brake, and a connection mode would be one that can operate both of those in proper harmony, right?
Absolutely.
What
Absolutely. And I think about it this way too, Joel. Like if you're driving, just a highway that goes on forever theoretically, and you're stuck on the gas pedal, what's going to happen? Eventually you're going to get in a wreck or you're going to run out of gas. And so I think about that in action mode when the issue is not experiencing action mode or shutdown mode. The issue is getting stuck because when we get stuck in that, then we're not flexible. We can't respond to the circumstances. That's when we are dysregulated, when we are stuck in one of those modes, one of those survival modes. So if you're stuck on that gas for too long, you're going to end up getting in a wreck, or you're going to end up, completely running out of gas and just shutting down. And then when you're stuck on the brake, you're just in shutdown mode and you have to wait for someone to kind of help you pull you out of that. And so, I think that when we're in connection, you have access to the gas and brake and you're a lot more in control and you're not stuck. You're a lot more flexible.
Yeah. What are some defining characteristics of athletes? Because I have like pictures in my head of these things in athletes I've worked with. But defining characteristics of an athlete who might be stuck in action mode more, or defining characteristics of an athlete who's prone to getting stuck in shutdown mode and how to recognize those.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, there's nuance here. It's always hard to cover in one conversation, the nuances. So I'll just kind of have a disclaimer of like, depending on people's personality and circumstances and across age and gender and sports, these things can look different. However, talking generally, when we're saying action mode, I typically look for an athlete, if it's before a competition, it's pretty easy to see it sometimes. Maybe their eyes are kind of darting around all over. Maybe they're looking into the stands a lot. They're kind of feeling a little tense or jittery. Maybe their shoulders are raised up and they're kind of breathing with their upper chest. They look a little anxious or worried. Maybe if you have a conversation with them, they're not really listening. It's hard for them to, pay attention or concentrate on what you're saying or what you're telling them. And then, in performance, maybe they're quick to make decisions that they shouldn't make. Maybe they're a little impulsive or reckless, or maybe, they look a little bit stressed when the pressure's on, avoid responsibility, all these kinds of things. So in action mode, I would say those are some of the defining characteristics.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I think it's just really important. Yeah, like you said, there's nuance, but to be able to recognize that and see that, and that's something too, like I said, in my 20s, none of this was even on my radar, which looking back, I'm like, man, that's crazy. And then every year since then, it's like learning more and more to recognize these things in action. And so, ultimately, I know we'll talk about how, the goal then, of course, right, is to bring athletes into that connection experience. I know we'll talk about that here. I have it for you in a few questions, a bunch of questions about that. But I did want to cover briefly, how is it exactly that athletes, like you talked about social media comparison. I wrote the superlative. I like that word, superlative. Like you're always bombarded with things that are the best. Talk a little bit about like how athletes perceive stress now, or how their stress tank operates based on that added dimension that we didn't have 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that takes a perspective where you have to look at the person as a whole across environments and not just in the sports context. Because if you're just taking that hour and a half, you have for practice, it's kind of hard to see it, but you need to see what's their brain and body bringing into this environment. Where are they starting? What's happened the other 22 and a half hours before this. And so when I think you have that integrated perspective, you're able to see the nervous system inside the athlete and how it's moving them and operating, rather than just, seeing kind of the observation or symptoms in that hour and a half of practice. So when we take that perspective, typically on average, an adolescent right now is spending about 5 hours on social media alone. So just on social media platforms, for some that may be 4, or for some that may be 7 or 8 or 9 hours. And then even, 10, 12 hours on, computer screen time, those kinds of things. So, you're spending 5, 6 hours scrolling. You're exposing yourself to hundreds and thousands of images and videos and things that are just little clips. And these are edited, these are filtered, and humans are wired to socially compare. And so you're going to naturally socially compare yourself if you're a human being. Now, if you're a human being in adolescence between the ages of 10 and 25, you are more wired to socially compare yourself, especially to people around your age. So your brain is naturally going to start to evaluate yourself compared to others more heavily than any other period in your life. And so if you're exposed to these thousands of images and videos a day that you're spending 5+ hours on, and you're seeing the most perfect highlights, the most perfect skin, the most perfect performance, the most perfect, house and wealth and all these things. And then most of your comparisons are going to be upward social comparisons, which means that you're seeing yourself in a negative light, you're seeing everything else in a more positive light. And so when you feel like there's a distance between how you are, like not feeling good enough, and how everyone else is, or how everything else is, and you feel that gap, you're going to try, well, one, you might feel depressed about that. 2, you're going to be anxious to try and close that gap. So whether that means you trying to collect more status, making more posts, or, putting extra pressure on yourself when you're performing in your next game or competition, you're going to try and seek that approval. You're going to try and seek that validation. And I think typically, humans, we all get caught in this, but especially with social media, this is, the heart of the matter is that we're seeking external validation and hoping that it'll provide an internal security. And I just don't think that we can do that. No matter how many likes or favorites or praise you can get from other people, it can't quiet that kind of internal insecurity that we feel if you think there's a gap between you and everyone else.
Yeah, I think the next natural question with that would be, and again, it's like I know we'll get into this as you go throughout the system, but I am interested. I think right off the tail end of that. how do we, I'll say too, you did mention in the book, I really like this. Like you mentioned just how important and sacred of a space sport is, because sport is where you experience life without the consequences of it being a game like war, where like you lose, you die, sport,
Yeah.
we have a scaled version of that where it's a little more, there's more room for learning. And even it's in some ways, it even makes me think about Paul Cater, who's been on the show, has said even strength and conditioning is a subset of sport. If we think like war, sport, I'm making these tears with my hands. People can't see it, but like war's at the top. It's the most like, they're the most original. Then you have games, the versions of combat. And then you have below that training, strength and conditioning, like a gym where you might do different games, free play, gym class. It's almost there's where there is the most room. It's not your sport practice. You're not afraid of getting cut, this, that, or the other. Anyways, I just appreciate how you had mentioned sport was such a sacred space for learning. And my question would be, in light of these stressors and all these things that people are exposed to, okay, we're in practice. You don't have your phone. Your social media is not engaged right now. How do we, with that in mind of comparison, upward comparison, create a space for the positive? Well, first, what are those positive things we are, like present moment, self-love, self-acceptance, those things. But how do we create that and foster that in our training environment?
Right. The survival modes like shutdown and action that we kind of want to steer, away from, in which a dysregulated nervous system is stuck in, maybe those other hours in a day. But when they come to practice, I think we need to realize that those survival modes were developed because at one point in time, it was about survival. It was our physical lives that were on the line. And so our bodies and brains developed these systems to help us survive. However, our physical lives are no longer at stake, right? You're not going to practice and there's a wild lion on the corner field and you have to get into fight or flight and figure it out. However, now we have more social dangers, right? It's not a literal lion, but maybe that threat now is coach or a teammate, thinking negatively about me when I missed that jump, or me making a mistake, or, my parent that puts a lot of pressure on me, coming down on me after the game if I don't perform that great, or whatever the threat is. And so even though there's not these literal physical threats to our lives now pushing into survival modes, there's social, mental, emotional threats that are still triggering the same survival instincts. And so I think first and foremost, coaches and, the trainers can do a really good job just creating an environment of belonging, an environment of connection, where no matter, how dysregulated their nervous system might be, sending signs to that nervous system, to their brain and body, that this is a place of security. This is a place where you can take chances. This is a place not to do everything perfectly, because that doesn't exist in the first place, but a place to see how good you can be, a place for development. And not only that, but you're not alone. This is a we thing. We're doing this together. I'm not just telling you what to do and kind of leaving you out to dry, but I'm here with you. Any questions you have, I'm here to explore the space with you, and to find creative solutions to performance problems. And so I think just coaches being able to, if you're more in the traditional line of coaching, like I respect that. At the same time, I feel like there's just a lot of, cultural coaching the past like 30, 40, 50, 60 plus years that have just been all about, yelling. And that's how we create mental toughness. And that's just not backed by science. It's not backed by the research. And it's really not backed by personal experience. I would say being able to create an environment where athletes know that they belong, and then they begin to have their brain and body move into regulation, move into connection mode. And now they're able to push the boundaries and see what they're really capable of, instead of staying locked and stuck in a survival mode and never really seeing their true potential.
Yeah. Yeah. That's, so what I wanted to ask you is, it's a two-pronged question. And I want to ask one before we get any farther, because I think that, like you mentioned, there's that old tradition of coaching, like a lot of yelling. It's a lot more, like you even mentioned too, the differences between the genders. And I think we would think by nature, okay, if you are going to yell at someone, the boys or the guys can handle that a lot better, obviously, than the girls. In how we're wired. My thought is, though, where I feel like it would be easy to say, okay, like there's something in coaching that's like fiery. There might be a place for like yelling or a more masculine experience in the right place, especially for males. I mean, do you have any further thoughts on just because for me, I don't know the answer personally. I feel like, but internally, I do think there is something about a little bit more of I could just call it like a fiery experience. And I think on both genders, a fiery element is important for sure, I think. But yeah, just any thoughts on that, just that scale, just because I think it could be very easy to say, oh, it's all just going to be like talk therapy. You know what I'm saying? Like,
sure. Yeah, no, I get it. And that's not, what I'm advocating for. And I know you know that, but I'm all for passion. I'm all for, showing that you care. And I'm all for being a human being and letting, your top blow off sometimes. However, when that becomes like your tactic day in and day out, where you're trying to motivate by yelling or fear-based tactics, right? It's like putting gasoline on a fire. You may get a big blow up, which is probably why coaches do it again and again, because they feel like it gets a rise out of players and helps. But at the end of the day, it's not sustainable, and that fire is going to burn out. And if you think of it nervous system wise, if they're coming into practice or performance in action mode, already scared, already feeling insecure, and you push them further beyond that, now they're in shutdown mode. Now they're disconnected and they're really not performing their games. So even though your intentions are to motivate, to try and help them, play their game, I think that it ends up pushing them farther away a lot of times when it's kind of an everyday tactic. Now, I'm not equating that to, coach who really cares about their players and then from time to time might just, yell out of frustration or, something really matters to them, and halftime things get heated and passionate and they're just kind of letting it all out and yelling and this or that. I think there's a time and place for that. I think that, sometimes we do those things and we kind of regret it after, and sometimes we do it and it's like, oh, okay, no, I felt like that was genuine and that should have been said in that manner. And, it's a good fit. And it's obviously circumstantial. If you have good rapport with your players and there's history there, I'm sure you could get away with that more than if you're a new coach in a new environment. So I do think there's a time and place for it. I'm more so referring when that's kind of like your main go-to coaching tactic.
Yeah.
And also that idea, like, if you really look at it for what it is, you're probably mad as the coach because players seem unmotivated. And they don't have that intrinsic motivation, maybe like you do. And so you're trying to fire them up. And so you're trying to fire them up so you can get them to do what you want to do. However, in taking that tactic, they're just becoming more reliant on you yelling at them and you firing them up. So they're moving farther away from that intrinsic motivation. They're becoming reliant on something outside of them, which is you and you yelling. And so I think it kind of, as much as it may help in the moment or seems like it helps, it can also kind of defeat you as a coach, because then now you're having to burn 10 times the energy when maybe a couple different approaches may be a little bit more sustainable and help them kind of find their own motivation and not always be relying on you firing them up.
Today's podcast is sponsored by the Athletic Development Games educational program. This program includes a video library of fun and engaging games aimed at kids ages 4 to 10 years old. In the program, you'll find activities for speed, coordination, jumping, and more, with new videos added each month. The games are fun, engaging, and they also invoke the imagination. It's given me great ideas already for my youth sports teams, as well as plenty of games to play with my own children. To sign up for the course, you can head to athleticdevelopmentgames.com/app. And you can use the coupon code JUSTFLY, that's JUSTFLY with all caps, at checkout for an exclusive 50% off. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Yeah, as you were talking to, I had a couple thoughts. One was when Rachel Balkovic was on a long time ago. I think she moved from strength coach to hitting coach. I think the general manager now. She talked about, I watched this video she recommended. It was like Augie Garrido, like legendary baseball coach from Texas, I think, just ripping his players in the locker room after they got beat by, I don't know who, somebody. But the thing is, and then after that, after he just totally ripped their asses, they went back. I think they won all the rest of their games on that rest of the year. But it's like you said, it's the coach history, and it's also like that's not your only thing. You could compare that. I think the thing, if you watch Augie, it seemed like there was a really, from my understanding, I wasn't like, it was one of my only views of the coach. I mean, but he was like as passionate as you could possibly be. And I think underneath the yelling, he had this genuine love for the players that I'm sure they knew. And you could compare that to like that Rutgers coach that got fired, like however long, where it was all just, that was the whole practice, just constant bombardment. And that's all you had. And, I think there's more, even talking to NCAA about, well, what's the line of tough coaching? Where does that tough coaching line end and start to go into where it's like, it's not something that's done in love. It's damaging to the players. It's not something that's pushing the level forward. And so anyways, yeah, I was thinking too about some of the coaches I've worked with who were yelled a lot, but were, it wasn't their only go-to. Like if they were loved by their athletes, it was not that thing that defined them. It was something they occasionally did. Maybe they were a little grumpy and maybe occasionally, but they would always come back. Like there was always was a return to knowing that there was that safety, so for what it's worth, I just wanted to bring that up because I do think there's kind of those sides of the coin. But I agree. I'll say too, for me personally, when I was yelled at, sometimes I think there was times where it was okay. But the coach who did would always come back and be very you would tell is a safe place. And if I got yelled at, it was a good thing. I also had a coach where I got yelled at out of his frustration, and that was never, I just got mad, and there was nothing that really drove me forward at all from that one. So it was there's kind of nuance to it, So
no, there's so much nuance, and it's all context. And I even think of myself, and that's why I put that disclaimer of it's personality, it's age, it's gender, it's timing, it's this and that. There's so many factors. For me personally, I was always more, and I'm like this as a person, a cerebral athlete. I'm gonna overthink more. I'm gonna try my best and figure it out. But at the end of the day, I do better with less coaching. If you talk to me less and you just tell me to go play and you believe in me and you just give me looks of, assurance and encouragement, I'm probably beating myself up more in my head than, any coach ever will. But if you're yelling at me, that's only going to send me into shutdown mode. And then I'm going to disconnect and get frustrated, and the, vicious cycle continues. So yeah, again, there's a time and place, and I think these things need to be considered, and no coach is perfect and none of us are going to do it perfectly. However, I think, like you said, we just need to be open to our experiences there. If you do that, to be able to kind of come back to your baseline, be able to see is that what the team needed or that player needed at that point in time? As long as they're willing to be honest with that, I think, there's grace there and space to make mistakes, and there should be.
Yeah, I think, it's just that, what is that baseline? Is the baseline love and a connective environment that can foster growth? So I wanted to talk about gamification you talked about, and I just got an email from, I like following Gerwinder, who writes a lot of logic and ideas for life. And he had a great article a few months back about the gamification of life, where it's I think it's we talk about games and play, and it's great, but it's well, what about when everything is a game? Literally everything in life is gamified. Tell me a little bit about that. I know you wrote about your book and how that's impacted, especially Gen Z, and how they view practice and training and games and those types of things.
All right. Yeah, when I talk about gamification, I'm not talking about games like basketball and football, and not talking about competitions and track and field. More so just how our modern culture with social media and just media in general has really latched on to gamification, because humans are the product. Our attention span is the product that marketers are after. So if you're online, you're on these platforms, the products that you're looking at actually aren't them. You're the product. And so the more they can get us engaged, the more attention and time that we spend, the more money that they make, and the more they profit. So I think everything now has become this gamification, where we've kind of lost touch with relationships and human connection, and we've drifted more into this virtual world where if we're not attracted to somebody, we can swipe a certain direction. We don't have to see them again, and that's kind of instead of asking someone out on a date, you're sending a Snapchat. And so I feel and even if you're, the example I give for pumping gas, and I'm so tired of watching celebrity news videos or trick shot videos at a pump, at a gas station. There's no time where things aren't in your face and gamified and just trying to get your attention and engagement. And so, nowadays, I think that's the culture that these kids are growing up in, from the time. I know some people get iPhones as early, they get tablets very early, but when they're born, but iPhones as early maybe as 5 years old. It's not uncommon for a bunch of 8-year-olds to have it, second, third grade. And then, it's one thing to have social media, be a business owner in your 30s. It's another thing to have it from the time you're 8 years old all throughout your development. And so when things are constantly gamified, and gamified, I mean, it's all based on performance. Even your wristwatch and your Fitbit, you're trying to close that rings because you have some satisfaction when you close all those rings and you see the colors and the thing pops off and you feel great. Or you get some gamification when you get those likes or favorites, or, you have more influence. And it's all kind of this status game where instead of playing real games with real consequences and real challenges where you actually have to develop real skills and confidence and problem solving and identity formation, it's more of these artificial games. We're allocating our time and energy to these artificial games that prioritize appearance and performance and results. And when that becomes our focus, I think it really dysregulates our nervous system, because now we become more stressed when we have to face real life with real world challenges. And also our focus is going to be on results. And so when we do something in real life where there's a process and you make mistakes and you have to be okay with things feeling awkward or not being good at something, and you have to be persistent and patient, you get really frustrated and you're quick to shut down and give up, and you're not as resilient as you could be because your nervous system isn't as resilient as it could be because it's been kind of conditioned in these artificial games. And so that's kind of what I mean when I say gamification of life.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Because I think, on one end, it's like, wait, games are fun. Like, shouldn't we warm up with games for practice and those things, so I think the question might be, well, naturally, where does this show up in the training session? And the things that come to mind on my end would be, well, a few things, and let me know what you think of any of these. Is one, it's like, metrics. Metrics are good, but what if everything's a metric? We're going to measure your force split, your bar speed, your recovery score, and everything. And again, it's like, well, I don't know where exactly is the line for too much and just to let it ride. Or like outputs. I think too, even in like track and field, some days if it's like the horizontal jumps, sometimes you measure the jumps, sometimes you just jump and just to get the reps, or maybe it's just a target. You don't even know how far it is. It was just, or like parkour. If you're out and doing parkour, it's the experience. Do you know exactly how far it was from log to log or rooftop to rooftop? You just do it because it's fun. It's for the experience of being in the present moment. Or Nick Willis had a good, he's like one of the most prolific, if not honestly the most prolific miler of all time. I think he broke 4 minutes like 19 years in a row. Insane.
Wow.
And he would always take like a month or two where he did just informal, air quotes, he called it informal training, where I don't think there was times he had to hit. It was just go out for a run in the hills and just enjoy that run in the hills, like type thing. So yeah, with that in mind, and the last thing I'll say, here's the other thing, was like a rank, record, publish, like, Tony Holler, Feed the Cats. Like, yeah, obviously you're sprinting. You want to know your time. You want to know where you are. I think that is really helpful to drive results forward. So in the midst of all those things, thoughts on just a balance. How do you look at the training session in light of the gamification of life and how that relates to what we're seeing in a practice environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times, and metrics are good. And, I think sports are both an art and a science. So it's a craft. So you need to have both. And, the modern, science and modern metrics and equipment and everything absolutely have their place and are fantastic. I just think with our cultural trends right now, we can get very easily lost in that and just try and reduce these experiences, these places of formation, down to just that, when literally every other aspect of their life right now are all about, results and all about appearances and all about numbers and metrics. I think it's refreshing for, adolescents and any athlete to be able to step away from that and just be in the present moment and have the experience of a training session, have the experience of competitive practice, have the experience of a game, but they don't always have to be, so drilled on results, especially nowadays, right? Expectation. Like kids are in, you got to like test in like kindergarten nowadays. It's getting ridiculous. And, everything, I know you bring it up on the podcast, like every club team is like elite now and has that in their name. So it's just like, we're so infatuated with that idea. I think, psychologically, because we're so insecure inside, that we're like looking for that validation that your kid's good enough or that you're good enough or whatever it is that we're looking for. We need some measurement or some proof that tells us that we're good enough, rather than just being able to live from that place of belonging, know that you are good enough, and then have fun doing the thing, have fun training, have fun seeing really what you're capable of. And as an aside too, from that, it's like, basketball player, if I help train him to get a higher vertical, that's fantastic. That should absolutely result in him being a better basketball player, but that's not guaranteed. Like, he still may go out there. He may be a worse basketball player. He may be the same basketball player. He may be better. I don't know. So I think at the end of the day, whatever context we're in, whatever performance environment we're in, like, use that as your metric, as your ultimate metric. Like, what is their performance like? What are they like as a player? Are they more secure in themselves? Are they more confident? Are they able to take chances where they couldn't before? Are they doing things on the court or field that they couldn't before? Like, being able to use those as our metrics, and kind of put them in this perspective that looks at the whole person rather than just, seeing a number, seeing one performance on a test that they're not going to have to do when competition day comes. So I think, having that total perspective is a little refreshing these days.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, like you said, like, metrics are definitely good. Like, it's fun to jump to jump on the jump mat and get your time and, get your max force or whatever it is. But at the same time, I think when we try to boil the equation down to just those things, and we don't include like the social emotional, the mental emotional. I know for me, it wasn't, an extra 2 inches on my single leg running jump was not the factor for me in high school. It was insecurity. And like, I've talked about this story on the podcast where my coach was like, "Hey, we're playing this team next week. They're pretty good. They have the player of the year on their team. Joel, you're going to pretend to be the player of the year, and you get to basically shoot whenever." And literally, I couldn't miss. Like, and I was having so much fun being that person because you could call it an identity shift. Like, for me, it's almost like the identity I had created for myself was someone who doesn't shoot that well, is more of a hustler, athletic, gets rebounds, like those kind of things. I definitely can't shoot threes. Like, I had created that identity, and then it's like, as soon as I was able to step outside that and be something else, that completely changed it. And if I would have been able to encounter that more times, like, if my coach, I wonder what he thought about that after, like, that day, like, because he had always said for me in practice, he said something like, he's like, "We're one Joel Smith away from winning the conference," or something. Because basically, it was, does Joel play well or doesn't he? He saw that I had a lot of potential, but he saw that I was so up and down. And honestly, it was just mentally and emotionally. And like, so it was, that was it. I was always obsessed with the physical piece. I mean, I wasn't that good. But mind you, listening, this was a small school league. This is not like, I wasn't going to go D1 or anything. So, but anyways, all that being said, yeah, I do think that, looping that in is really important. So, any other thoughts on that?
I would say on that, just like creating the space, right, for players to step up and step into whatever's next for them. Like, I love that example that you gave because, it was a narrative in your head and you were locked into that narrative. And that's just part of being a human being. We create these narratives, we feel safe and comfortable there, and we kind of go through the motions. But like, what happens if you encounter an environment and you have a support figure that is willing to push you out of that narrative and really see what you're capable of? And I think when we boil down coaching, whether you're strength and conditioning or you're specifically in a sport or whatever it is, like, that's what our job is. It's to help push people out of their narratives right now to really see what they're capable of and help them believe in that, continue forward. I'm experiencing that in life just in general. It's like, we're always looking around to see who's more qualified or who's going to do this or that, or I can't do that because, I'm this way. And it's just like, that's every area of life. At the end of the day, we kind of just need to give ourselves the green light and step in it, and see what happens. And that's how you grow. You put yourself in those positions and you live as if that's the reality, and then it becomes reality.
Yeah, that's one of those things too, that games, not gamification, but games, I think does so well, is the game is like life. Like, you can't metric your way. Once you're in the game, the metrics don't really mean anything anymore. It's entirely like the connection, right? It's how you integrate it dynamically. And that's like the joy of that complexity. I think it's this amazing thing, and it's something that will take us a lifetime to figure out, and then we still won't have figured it out. And that's what makes the game. So I think, that's one of those things that I do think comes back to how that is a sacred place. And, the metrics are nice, but ultimately it has to become that thing at some point. So David, I did want to ask, okay, so in your book, you talk about B.E.T. So the stands for your breath, touch, and then eyes, I believe. I'd love to, for you to expand on that, because we've talked a lot about, issues, stress, and all these things. And of course, what do we do practically? How are some things that we can help rewire the brain, create a sense of safety and connection? Tell me about your process there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say everything we talked up to this point is kind of part one of the book. So that's laying out the psychological framework to understand modern athletes and really kind of understanding some of these things that are behind it, like social media, performance gamification. And I know we're always eager to get to the practicals and the strategies, and I am too. However, I think, coaches and just people in general can really benefit from the understanding piece. Like if we start to approach athletes with more of an understanding of their nervous system, of their brain and body, and kind of putting these pieces together, the culture and, what's happening in their lives, then from that place of understanding, we coach differently. And we will be a little bit more connected to the athletes, help them perform better, but also help them just develop better and more humanly speaking, be a little bit more holistic approach. And so, that's kind of part one. So part two, talking about B.E.T, the B.E.T method. So breath, eyes, and touch. So it's three avenues to help regulate your nervous system, regulate your brain and your body. So our nervous system, the brain and body, it's like a highway. They're constantly sending signals to each other. And so the brain's talking to the body's talking to the brain. So how do we calm down our nervous system? How do we live better? How do we perform better? Well, you access that information that's going back and forth. And so 80%, when you talk about the vagus nerve, 80% of its information is going from the brain to the body, and 20% is coming from 80% is coming from the body to the brain, 20% is coming from the brain to the body. So what that tells me is if I can regulate my body just through sensory tools and things I'll talk about, the breath, eyes, and touch, then that's, influencing 80% of the information that's going up into my brain. So not only am I calming down my body so I can perform better, so I can feel better, but at the same time, it's calming down my brain. It's going to calm down my mind and help me to perform from that connection mode. And so, we'll just kind of, you guys take those individually, but with breath, I'm talking about simple practical tools. Like if you extend your exhale longer than your inhale, you're engaging the brake, right? You're accessing the parasympathetic, and then that's calming down your brain and your body. So even just a simple tool like that, you're in a heated competition or before practice or whatever the moment is, you don't always need to do, 5 minutes of mindful breathing. That's great if you can, and we can talk about that. But even something as simple as like, if you're a volleyball player, you were just making this intense play. Now you're back and you have to serve. You have to regulate your system quickly. Taking an extra couple seconds to just extend your exhale, then that's going to access parasympathetic. Now you're a little bit calmer. You're going to feel less jittery and less rushed on your serve. So that's going to result in a more consistent serving motion and better performance. So a little tool like that with breathing, I think, is really helpful. Also with breathing, just kind of stay there, and then I'll kick it back to you. But the big thing is functional versus dysfunctional breathing. When we have a dysregulated nervous system, I mentioned earlier, our shoulders tend to get raised up. We kind of breathe through our mouths and through our upper chest. And, optimal breathing, functional breathing, how we're designed to breathe through our diaphragm and the other, 10 pounds of breathing muscles we have is through our belly. It's diaphragmatic breathing. So deep breath, Patrick McCown is famous for this with Oxygen Advantage, is not one where you're trying to fill your chest up like a superhero, but it's low and it's slow. So you're breathing through your belly and you're slowing down your breath. And when you slow down your breath, like I said, you enter into, you hit the brake and enter more into connection mode. So it's not only the tricks like extend your exhale, but it's also like, how are you breathing? Are you breathing functionally or dysfunctionally? And can we help you breathe through your nose and your belly rather than your mouth and your upper chest?
Yeah. So with breathing especially, and I found some groups to be very receptive to it, especially at the end of like a strength training session, very receptive many times. But I could see a lot of, and that was in university, college, I could see it being potentially more difficult with high school athletes. Like, why am I doing this? Or what are some, maybe if you had like a list of almost like the easiest place to start, and then working to more complex or more, more depth to the breath work, where would you start with a group that's like, hey, first time, we're just going to make this low barrier, like that kind of thing?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. If, they're coming in like to practice or before a game, to be able to have some routine that you kind of do together. So some breathing routine. You take that principle of extending the exhale longer than the inhale. So even if you're breathing in for 3 seconds and exhaling for 6 seconds, or you're breathing in for 4 seconds and exhaling for eight, try and double that inhale on the exhale, and do that for a couple rounds. Maybe it's just once or twice, and that's weird enough for them, and so they're adjusting a little bit, or maybe they're kind of gun ho about it. You can do like Andrew Huberman, cyclical sighing. So that's where you take a little inhale, take like a 1 to 2 second inhale, and then kind of like a half second inhale, and then extend the exhale. There's different techniques, but I would say as far as a starting point, extend that exhale for longer, do like a 3-6 or a 4-8 ratio, and do that just a couple times, before practice or before a game, or have them do that before moments. In volleyball, have them do it before serve. In basketball, have them do that, in timeouts or end of quarters. Being able to, in the chaos of competition, being able to find connection mode again and again. That's one simple strategy that you can integrate into the environment, integrate into the competition to help them be able to find that connection mode in these little moments they have.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. There's so many ways of breathing out there. I think, we, in sports performance, there's so much emphasis on barbell sets and reps, for example, and all these iterations, or, sprint volumes. And how many types of breathing do we ever learn? If anything, it might be reduced to, hey, just do some belly breathing, which I think is a great place to start. But it's interesting to think, well, what if you had 3 or 4 or 5 different types of breathing, and you found maybe 1 or 2 that really worked well and hit home with the group you had and give you a little bit of leverage in different situations. I like what you said about, I didn't know this until I read your book, was the vagus nerve, like it being like a bottom up, like the body feeding what the brain is experiencing. And it reminds me of, I think it was Simon Capon. He talked about like basically it's like ways, how do we like hack the mind, really the conscious mind? And he talked about generating emotion, like doing things to generate emotion. Or even, I think it was Tony Robbins that said something like, oh, if you're in a funk, go he goes and jumps at his little cold plunge thing. But you do something with the body. Like you could do 50 push-ups. You do something to the body to change the brain. Yep. And that's I think that's the beauty of it. Because I think so often coaches just think, oh, I'll just, yell at the person more, or there's frustration. Why aren't you doing this way? Even, there's a funny story. This goes back to the yelling thing a little bit. This was the funniest thing to me is this was at Cal, and I was watching a water polo game. And I think we were playing Long Beach or something. And it was I don't know, 10-0, 10-0 at halftime. We were just destroying them, and their coach, he made the players get in. I mean, this is probably borderline. I don't think I would do this, but you know what? This worked because he made the players, didn't even talk to them. He yelled at them for a minute, and then they got in the water and they were doing butterfly reps at halftime. Didn't even talk to them mentally up here, right up in the forebrain. It was all just get in the water, and I guess it was a shock their system thing. And everyone's kind of everyone in the stands was laughing at these guys, ha ha, they're getting beaten. They're how embarrassing. But you know what? I mean, honestly, that after halftime, they came back. They didn't win, but they started playing markedly better. And so, is that the best thing to do? I don't know. But you know what? It hacked the brain that went up into the body. A change. It's hey, these guys don't need to be talked to right now. They need to make a change in the body that will propagate up into the mind, and something will switch. So, it was. And I'm all for getting creative to find solutions to kind of pull you out of those modes that you're in. You're down 10-0, you're discouraged, you're feeling defeated. The majority of them are probably in shutdown mode. They're starting to shut down and disconnect. Especially when you're in shutdown, I feel pretty competent as a coach right now to help players get out of action mode. It's definitely the easier mode to help get out of and get back in connection. But when someone's in shutdown, it's tough. It really is. They're shut down, so they're not as socially available. They're not as engaged. It's hard, and I found that you can even get silly and creative and just change the environments. Maybe it's going outside and getting some fresh air, going on a walk. Maybe you. An example would be a girls volleyball team, in practice, people are feeling defeated and shut down or whatever. Maybe a couple of them are on the cheer squad. You help them lead a cheer or a dance team, something like that. I know you gave a
before we press the record example of, some players in the high school team being able to do a dance, like just something silly, like take them, into the hallway, get them out of that environment and do the hokey pokey. Like, I don't care. Do something creative that just completely shocks their system, because we're making things such a big deal in our head. And I'll connect this kind of what we were talking about before of like, you're getting a lot of messages in your brain that things are at stake. You're getting a lot of messages to your brain that, you're not doing a great job, or this isn't going the way you want it to. You're feeling threatened and insecure. So how do you help kind of shift that into security? Well, you change the messages that are coming from your body and your environment. Okay. So get out of that environment and do something different, change the drill, change whatever, but also like change the messages that are coming from your body. If your body is frazzled and jittery, or your body's just disconnected and lethargic, now let's do some things like breathing, working on our eyes and our touch to be able to start changing the messages that are going up to our brain. I mean, when that changes, then, it can change your entire narrative. So, some of those things may look silly or sound silly, but the reality is that the biological reality is that we're changing the signals from the body to the brain. And that's what's going to pull us out of that.
Interesting. That's so fascinating. I was just thinking about too, a high jumper I worked with a long time ago. I worked with him for 2 years, and then I got a job at Cal, and then he was coached for 2 years by another coach, and he was a shutdown athlete. So high jump, I mean, he was insanely talented guy. You could, between the legs dunk, basketball player, really great build for high jump. But if he missed a bar once or more than once or twice, it could kind of be a little bit up and down. But as soon as there was too many misses on the day, he would go into shutdown mode. He would sit there on the mat and completely shut down, and he wouldn't even jump. Like, he was just done. He was clearly dealing with something internal. And so after I left, and I didn't honestly have the answer for that. I usually just practice was done. I can't do anything. But after I left, I had heard a story. He ended up winning the national championship his senior year. And I was told that he would make the head coach or his coach like put his head on backwards, do something silly every time before he jumped. And it's like, why is he making him do that? Like, why is he, it's because, like you said, it's almost like you have to do something to break your external environment. Like, it's funny, like the silliness piece. I remember when I was at Wisconsin lacrosse, grad school, like a rich track history school, the girls team always had like a silly, like a dress, like a silly dress to practice. Like they dress up in costumes or different things. The guys never did it. It's almost like, I feel like if I had to generalize as my experience, I do think generally speaking, it seems like guys are a little more action and girls a little more, especially academic. Like if the girls are really academic and they're really immersed in that, it's easy to shut down. So maybe that was better. But then again, I've had plenty of girls in action mode too. So I don't know, it's just interesting to think about what to do with that. And I was always in action. If I had to classify myself, I was way more of an action person. And if people did something silly, if my coach like did something like that, I would be like, what do you do? I don't know if it would, I don't think it would change anything. Honestly, I don't know. So it's just kind of, I actually would do well. Like if a coach said, hey, go run like a fast 100 meters before your next high jump, I'd be like, okay, like that, I'll feel more like, I don't know. For some reason, it's just interesting, the differences there.
Yeah, and I think every player and their coach, this is kind of working with some teams right now and coaches, each player needs a personal menu, because what's going to work for one player might not work for the other. So even just this past, 2 weeks ago, sitting down with a couple teams, high school volleyball teams, and we had, the second day of this camp we were doing, I sat down and each player came through and just kind of talked about, where they tend to be. Are they more in action or shutdown? And then figuring out one or two things that kind of help them. So for a couple of the players, it's key teammates providing that touch, provide that encouragement after they make a mistake. Maybe another player is just that when they go to the bench, they can have their own space to not be bothered for a second, just take, a minute. Or maybe, for another player, it's thinking this motivational phrase helps them, or, whatever it is, or it's a breathing technique. So just figuring out for each player what that looks like. But I think at the heart of that, whether you're in action or shut down, and I love the example of, turning the hat backwards, even though it may not work for everybody, is you're finding ways to engage the play instinct rather than the survival instinct. And so being able to play a game freely and with security rather than being in that survival, action shutdown mode and getting stuck. Because I think when we play defensive, when we play scared to make mistakes, all these things, we're not playing to our potential because we're trying to survive. rather than like curiously and creatively trying to see how good we can be.
Mm-hmm.
And, and again, it's kind of because of the threats going on in our brains that we're registering. But I thought this was really interesting. In the book, I wrote about it, of how, you know, rats are similar to humans in the sense, like their neuroscience, they have a play and a survival instinct. And so, scientists are taking these rats and they see that when they're with other rats, they're like squeaking in laughter because their play instincts are activated. If, however, they take a scent of a cat, so the smell of a cat, and they place it in that environment, their play-based instinct turns it off and their survival instinct turns on. So they get real paranoid. They're looking around because they can smell the danger. They can sense, that's something is maybe going to happen. That's threatening to them. And so I think humans are much of the same way. When we're playing games and sports, when we're play-based, we're feeling secure, we're bonding, we're connected. However, when we start to feel a little bit threatened, a little bit in danger, maybe of embarrassing ourselves or whatever the threat or danger is, the play instinct starts to shut off and the survival instincts start to shut on. We get a little bit more defensive and self-protective. So funny things, like a coach turning their hat backwards, maybe he's worried about what the coach thinks. Maybe he's worried about the pressure that people put on him or their expectations. And when a coach does that, it sends that signal of safety of like, dude, it's a game. Like, just go out and do your thing. I trust you. I believe in you. We're here just having fun and seeing how good you can be. And then, that's what he needs for his brain to kind of switch into that play mode instead of that survival mode.
Maybe even like projection of a father figure onto the coach. And then I'm just kind of getting deep into it. But, it could be, who knows, like it's interesting to think. Okay, so that's cool. So breath, I know, like eyes. What about the eyes, and how can we work with that in a practice environment, or game environment?
Yeah, I mean, I know you've had like Rob Gray on, and constraints-based approach and just like learning and performance environment. Like, we connect so much visually, like so much of our brain power and our neurons are wired for the visual system, and we're visual creatures. And so just using our vision to be able to inform our instincts in performance environments rather than always trying to think through what we're going to do. Because so much of games and competition, it's the hindbrain, it's the back brain, and not the forebrain. Like, yes, you need your forebrain sometimes. You need to be able to think through and make decisions. But the best athletes and most adaptable ones are the ones that, don't have to consciously think through every motion or every decision or every move. They can just ride on their instincts and use their eyes to read and anticipate and make plays. And so for me, it was funny, right? I played basketball my whole life, played so many games. And then I'm a young adult playing in a league. And I realized that I just started using my eyes for the first time. And what I mean by that is, like, I feel like so much of growing up and playing in adolescence, it's like my eyes were there, but they weren't really there. I was more so playing the game like in my head and not the game on the court, where I was predetermining the moves I was going to do or trying to think about this thing or that thing or worried about what the coach thought. And I wasn't really in touch with what was happening on the court. I wasn't really looking for helpful cues or, reading certain signs in the environment to be able to just trust my instincts. And so I was kind of just playing with that on my own personal experience and then diving into the literature. But being able, and they have things like quiet eye training and things like that, I'm sure a lot of listeners know about, but being able to intentionally engage your eyes into the environment, is huge. And it sounds so simple, but the eyes really help you get out of your head and onto the court or the field. And so the more you can focus your eyes on helpful cues, like if you're a volleyball defensive player and serve receive, when they're about to serve it, instead of thinking about the mistake you made and getting caught in your head or this or that, being able to intentionally look at that server's hand and the ball and the contact they're making with it. So you can pick up, okay, is it going short? Is it going long? Is that spin? Is it knuckle? You're able to read it. That way you're kind of trusting your instincts and you're externalizing your attention. You're putting your attention on something outside of yourself. So you're not getting caught on something inside of you, right? Like in your head. So eyes are helpful. And then I include a couple of exercises like vergence exercises where you take an object, maybe it's even your finger, and it's 4 to 6 inches in front of your face, and you focus on that, and then you focus on a distant object, and you 2-3 seconds each, you go back and forth. That helps regulate the nervous system. So vergence exercises are helpful. But I think the most helpful is very quick and easy. It's called panoramic or landscape vision. So if, Joe and I do this even on air right now, you just like look forward to an object. You just engage your vision with something, in front of you. And as you're doing that, you keep your vision focused on that object, but you intentionally notice the top of your vision and the bottom of your vision and both sides. So you're really engaging the periphery and the whole panoramic vision. And when you do that, you start to activate that parasympathetic. You start to activate that brake pedal and kind of move more into connection mode, because when we get stressed, we get tunnel vision. And our vision literally constricts. And there's good research, even in performance environments, where our vision, we are less creative in solving performance problems. We're less able to see what's in our peripheral vision, which a lot of information for athletes comes through. So the more we're able to engage our total vision and not get stressed and locked into tunnel vision, I think the better athletes will be, and it also helps regulate us. So I think eyes are very important.
I love that. I have a lot of thoughts. One was I really enjoy a term I think of. This has been something that's been more and more something that's probably been on my radar since I went to Return to the Source, Rafe Kelly's retreat, like 3 years ago. And they talked about rich environments a lot. And I think the whole Evolve, Move, Play, Rafe Kelly's thing is very much in line with what you're talking about, like touch, like play, connection, like all those things. And they talked about rich environments. Like we were playing tag in a stream once, like all these rocks and high and low rocks. So we played tag. And one of the guys playing tag was like, this environment is so rich. And it's very stimulating. There was so much around that you constantly had to use all your senses and gravitation, vestibular eyes. And I think about what's a rich training environment and how much of our bodies can we engage in. And like you were saying, and in your book, it's like the 80% of the body driving the changes. And I find, if you do movements and you throw like, hey, instead of that sprint, chase a tennis ball, or something it's a task, but there's also a visual component. It changes how you sprint for the better in most cases. And the time, especially on the level of timing. And it's like this thing that gets your body fully attuned into that present moment. And you can use those in many different ways. And it's a concept I'm putting this together in a course that I have coming out soon. And so I think that, but for me, I think that, I'll just leave it at that. I just think there's so much more than just than just the other parameters. Oh, the last thing I'll say is, even as you were saying though, too, like in coaching high jump, I'm already thinking, I could put my finger in front of my face and look at my finger and then look at the high jump bar and then switch back and forth, and because I think people don't see, I see too, even in cases where you could say long jump, or there's cases where people's vision actually does impact the way their ability to run a curve. I've seen it and judge where the bar is. And again, we only look so much at like the plyometric part of it or the strength part or the technical part, but it's like, there's also the vision is kind of the glue in many ways that brings a lot of that together. And I'll even see too, I don't have enough people to like feel like I can truly confirm this, but even when people take off in high jump, good high jumpers can kind of keep their eyes on the bar for just a little bit longer. Like they kind of let their body turn around their vision a little bit. Whereas I've seen people who I believe are a little more of that over sympathetic drive, they close everything off to the bar a little quicker and just kind of like, sometimes they'll even close their eyes. A lot of times they even close their eyes. It's almost like that vision shuts off. And it's just something that's fun. I think for me, I personally need to like find more like game type things of vision. I have a hard time like, hey, do saccades and put your thumbs out and let's switch. I'm like, this is fine, but I'd rather, I don't know. I'm sure it's probably helpful. I don't do it. Anyways, I think that's just so cool, the richness of it all.
Absolutely. No, I'm with you too. And, thinking about that, I don't know much about high jumping, but from what you're saying, it makes total sense. If someone's more in action mode and kind of has that anxious or chaotic energy of action mode, then they're going to be less settled in their vision, which is going to impact their performance. So they're not really locked onto the bar and really seeing it through the whole jump. But maybe they're just too jittery and kind of taking their eyes off. They look a little eager and impulsive rather than like settled and alert. And I see that last night. I was training, some players in the basketball gym going through a session, and I'm seeing that in their free throws. I'm seeing that in their free throws, after they do something, maybe we do some reps or go live and they're not performing that well. Then when they get to the line, they're quick to kind of bail out of that shot. They're quick to just kind of like move their eyes or give up easily, rather than like starting strong and seeing it all the way through and locking their eyes to whatever part of the rim, usually back of the rim, that they like to look at. But using your eyes in those moments where your body just kind of wants to like crawl out of that situation, or your body's just anxious and wants and jittery, or you're in shutdown and you're ready to just kind of give up, being able to use your eyes to like stay connected to that present moment and stay connected to that task, so that even when you're not feeling great, it helps kind of move you back into that connection.
Yeah. You talking about that makes me think of myself. I wish I could go back in my own basketball playing days as a coach or a third person, look at how my eyes reacted. And even now, honestly, if I play now, I'll probably be like aware of it. Because I have noticed too, even like playing, I would play like pickup games at Cal against, honestly, even the tennis team, sometimes we'd warm up and I'd play a pickup game with them. And I would notice like if my face would start to gain more tension, there was more likely I'd miss a shot. Like if I'm going through traffic and doing a layup, if I tensed up my face, there's a high chance I would miss. And I would imagine there's probably something in the eyes that are also involved. And it takes you back to, I was at a Douglas Heel Be Activated. And now it's like RPR is an offshoot of that, kind of like similar for people who are familiar with RPR. And Douglas had talked about when some people get worked on with therapy or it's painful or something, they close their eyes and they're shut out people. They're shut out the outside world people. And he wanted people to be able to keep their eyes open and maintain connection. If anything, it just is like, hey, I will stay connected to this thing as long as I need to and not shut out early. And
I'm glad you brought that up, man. That fires me up, because the vagus nerve connects to a lot of the muscles, like under our eyes and our face and our cheeks. And so it really is all about those signs of safety. Like when, we're wired, we're social creatures. We're wired to be able to read other people's gestures to us. So if like I start smiling at you and kind of nod along, if, a genuine smile, you can see the creases of the eye kind of wrinkle up a little bit, so it's more genuine. Like these are signs of safety, so that way it sends that message to your brain. The messages don't just come from your body, but they come from your environment. It sends those messages to your brain that you're safe and you're secure and this is a friend, and it puts you into that connection mode. So I think that's huge that you just said that. If you're kind of tense and you're in action mode, the vagus nerve is kind of getting kicked offline and you're not as connected. When you're more connected, your face, you can see that you're more socially engaged to other people and to the environment, and you're less strained. You're a little bit more open and receptive. And I think that shows the social component. And to kind of blend into that, that's where the T comes in, the touch factor. And so not just, your own personal individual touch with the environment. Like if I'm going to shoot a free throw in basketball, taking an extra second on the free throw line to like really feel the ball and really feel the grooves, it's going to help root me in the present moment. So I'm not as distracted or not as willing to kind of rush through it, but a little bit more present and anchored in the moment. But also physical touch with other people, like the social touch, and just good research and literature too, to show like how that actually changes our brain and its networks. And so, for instance, if I'm an athlete that makes a mistake, in a game, my brain's going to be in a certain mode where I'm maybe ruminating on that mistake or kind of kicking myself or whatever. That physical touch between a teammate, right? The high fives, the fist bumps, pats on the back, things like that, are going to change that brain network to where now I'm more grounded and rooted in the present moment. I'm more available to what's going on rather than ruminating on the past. And so that physical touch and the release, oxytocin and certain chemicals to be able to build the bond between teammates, to be able to build that sense of belonging is huge. We're social creatures. We need that social touch, and it's going to activate the vagus nerve. And so now you're sending those signals, not just from yourself, but also from other people, that, you're secure and that you can move into connection mode, and that's okay.
Yeah. That's awesome. In so many ways, it just speaks to like just playing games that involve a level of roughhousing before you practice, even. And how can we get this through these game experiences to create and facilitate a sense of belonging? Obviously, there's many ways to do it, but I just think about, thankfully, there's been that explosion of gameplay in especially the physical preparation space and the need for that and what Rafe Kelly's doing. And I remember just about the most, I guess you could say, warmed up and connected and aware I've felt in warming up and training. I went to an Evolve Move Play retreat with Aaron Cantor, who's been on this podcast, led it. And the warm up was basically like 5 minutes of like Ido Portal style, like shaking, bouncing up and down, and then arm swinging, like kind of Qigong arm swinging. And then it was like self percussion, like basically like you rub your calves and arms and you like pound on your chest and your back and just, you're getting that sensation. And then 5 minutes of rolling. So now you're touch the ground, rolling all over the ground for 5 minutes. And then you're roughhousing with other people, and you're, so it's like you're so immersed with, and you're laughing with other people, you're connecting. Aaron did a lot of stuff involving, like, I think like eye contact as well, as I remember. So there was just so many pieces there. And then I love what you said too, like high fives, fist bumps. That's something when I was in college, our coach would oftentimes, these are things I take for granted because I looked at everything as so physical back then, sets and reps and what was the protocols. But he would always say, hey, find a teammate, give him a high five, give him a fist bump, and again, I ignored that through my 20s because, like I said, I ignored that stuff. And then all of a sudden coming back in my 30s, I was like, oh yeah, that is important. So like even coaching high school now, especially, it's always like, finding spaces to give a high five, give a fist bump, chest bump, like whatever. And or like warming up with games. It's like we might be at high jump practice, but we'll warm up with games where, hold the other person's right arm and try to tap their knee, little roughhousey games. And the difference is it's just so cool. So it's, that touch piece is something that's been growing on me as I've gone through. And even too with, I hadn't thought about this so much, but I really like my own training has kind of leaned towards a little bit. Like I love working with sandbags and like club bells. And part of it is you have to grab and manipulate. There's just an embodying, like, and not that you don't do it with a bar, but it's like every time you have to find a way to grip the bag, it's usually a little different, or the club. And so I just think that's something we don't talk about that much in actual training as well, as that interaction with the surfaces and those things.
Yeah, the interaction with the environment, absolutely. Yeah, and that 2005 study where they associated the NBA teams that had the most physical touch with like better performance, and that's a cool one to kind of bring up. But what was cool, and I love research. I can kind of get lost in it, but going on what we said earlier, it's easy to kind of reduce things down to a metric or a certain evidence-based practice when a lot of this is. Even though we know it, a lot of it's still mysterious. And I think, a lot of it will be left that way. But it was cool, writing this book and talking about touch. And then a couple of months ago, another study came out that took free throw shooting in basketball. And they took two groups, and one group, after they missed the first free throw, they did not get any touch from their teammates. And the other group did get, touch from their teammates. And it was the group that got touch from their teammates. They did better, but they only did better after they missed the first one. And I thought that was really cool and validating of just that idea of being able to, if I'm like shooting a free throw and I missed, it's not because I don't know how to shoot a free throw. Like, you're a basketball player, you probably know how to shoot a free throw. What's really going to help you is being able to like not think about that over and over again, and to kind of reconnect with the present moment, or, not get stressed out that your teammates hate you because you missed a free throw, but just that belonging and connection with your team. And knowing that you're secure enough to be able to try again, and that you can do this, that power of people believing in you and showing that through a gesture, I think communicates more deeply than we're consciously aware of a lot of times.
Yeah. As soon as you were saying that, I was thinking about like volleyball, because that's like the sport where between each play, players just do it. They come together. Yeah. What,
amazing.
Tell me more about that 2005 study. Like, how did they go about measuring like the touch? Was it like high fives, or like what was the
it was high fives, it was fist bumps, it was chest bumps, it was looking in between quarters and all these things, like when they come together as a group. I forget who did it. I need to re-pull it up. I want to say it was around 2005. I think Steve Nash was playing, but looking at that and associating the teams that had the most touch throughout their games with the outcome of the games, with their performances. And it was a correlation. Obviously, correlation doesn't equal causation, but an interesting social factor that impacts the emotional, mental, and physical parts of the game as well. So it's really cool to kind of see that, and that now, like for 19 years later, some more research starting to really validate that within basketball, and then also within other sports too.
Yeah, I love that. That's so cool. Well, hey, I think that's about all the questions I have for you, David. Let's finish. Tell me about, and everyone listening, of course, about your book that you have out and where they can find that, and a little bit more about, that resource.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book, B.E.T, on it, so called Bet on It, A Psychological Approach to Coaching Gen Z and Beyond. It's on Amazon. The easiest way is just to go to my website, realdevelopment.org, realdevelopment.org. And when you go there, there's a banner on top. You can click there for the book. But I do want to, say if you're not ready to buy the book, or kind of having doubts or just want to check some stuff out first, I have a bonus chapter that I just wrote, and I'm putting out just as like a free PDF download on the website. And I say, place a bigger bet, the power of the added T, talk. So it's about talk and communication, but coach to athlete, teammate to teammate, and then self-talk in our own heads. So it's about the 18, 20 page PDF where it's really a bonus booklet for this book. So if you want to go check that out, download that, see if you like it. And the link from the book is there too. So it's called Bet on It, a psychological approach to coaching Gen Z and beyond.
Awesome. Well, sounds good. Well, everyone listening, go buy it. It's awesome. Thank you so much, David. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you listening, and I'll see you next week.